So welcome everybody to Grand Rounds this week. As Tom and Lara are doing the talking this week, I have suggested that I would share in order to give Tom a bit of bandwidth. You may have just heard him discussing the fact that he's ever so slightly jet lagged at the moment, so we'll be kind. Today's topic is one that I have a particular interest in, although I would not dare to claim any expertise. We're looking at vaccine hesitancy, and obviously that is particularly relevant at the moment because of the endless furore around COVID-19 vaccination. I'm absolutely delighted that we've been joined today by Lara Wood, who is a lecturer at Abertay University, and Lara made contact with me last year when we were originally, I think, when we'd been embroiled in the outbreak in the students at Abertay. And then we kept in touch since then and developed this talk as a concept. Lara has a real interest in the transmission, her specialism, I should say, is in the transmission of information in humans and non-humans. I'd love to know what chickens think of the current lockdown regulations. You can tell me afterwards. And her past includes posts in Durham and St Andrews, but she told me them too fast for me to write them down properly. So you can grill her on that afterwards if you'd like. I'm sure you're all very familiar with Tom, and we're going to start with Tom and some of his personal experience around vaccine denial, hesitancy, and the rest, and then we'll move on to Lara. So before I let Tom start speaking, just a general reminder that you're on Zoom, which is different from Teams, which some of you may be more familiar with. That means if you are making a noise in the background and not muted, we can't mute you. So please do just remember to make sure that you're muted at this point. If you've got any questions, please put them in the chat as we're going, or we will have plenty of time for discussion at the end. Thanks very much. Over to you, Tom.
Thanks very much. So thank you very much for inviting me to speak at Grand Rounds, which is not something I say very often, but it's very nice to be asked to speak a little bit. And the reason that I've been asked to speak here is because I am what my younger son refers to as a niche internet micro-celebrity. I'm sure he means it in a loving way, but it's bandied around our kitchen table as more of an insult. But so why does he think I'm a niche internet micro-celebrity? Well, I became one. I jumped into this, maybe it's my own fault, but in what date was this? This was in February or March of 2020, at the start of the COVID pandemic. This chap, Olivier Véran, as a French doctor and Minister for Health in France, took to Twitter, and he said, and it is in French, but he says that anti-inflammatory drugs such as ibuprofen and cortisone can be a factor in aggravating the infection of COVID-19. In the case of fever, take paracetamol instead. If you're already taking anti-inflammatories or you are in doubt, consult with your doctor. This tweet in and of itself seems fairly innocuous because anti-inflammatory drugs are known to be just as they are anti-inflammatory, and therefore there may be something in that you can make infections worse, particularly steroids. But this was picked up by mainstream media to say anti-inflammatories may aggravate COVID-19. France advisors, so not just this man just tweeting, it became the whole nation says this. And very rapidly, there was a whole raft of stuff on Facebook and Twitter saying, don't take COVID, it makes COVID worse, or even worse, says it gives you COVID. And this came on my Facebook feed. One day I saw it from maybe 24 people, and I didn't have a lot of friends on Facebook, so this was a big deal. And some of it was from nurses, some of it was from pharmacists, from some doctors. I thought, this is terrible. What's going on here? This is going to, for one thing, we're going to run out of paracetamol in Tesco, which is exactly what happened. This comes from this. This is again, it's in French. I'm sorry, but this is the statement to which he refers, which it was a policy, sort of a consensus statement written by this folk on do non-steroidal inflammatories cause infection, because there is some evidence that they do make staphylococcal skin infection much worse and lead to necrotizing fasciitis. There was one study in children that showed that pneumonia is slightly more likely if you take ibuprofen rather than taking paracetamol. So this data is not brilliant, but it's what this chap took, and this sort of escalated into a big deal. So what did I do about this? Well, I thought this was a bit rubbish, so I just wrote some stuff on Facebook to say, look, getting a lot of questions from people about this. Let me tell you something about ibuprofen, and this is what the guidance is. Here's a link to it, and you should take things sensibly. And this was shared 1,000 times, and then suddenly I became this person who wrote a lot of things on Facebook, and shared one of my posts was shared 150,000 times. At which point I became a niche internet micro celebrity. And having done that, I now get a constant stream of people writing to me on all sorts of media with lots of questions and queries concerned, but also quite a lot of people ranting at me saying, how dare I support X? And the most recent of those is, how dare I support vaccines? So fast forward a bit to December of 2020, and the release of the COVID vaccines. To my mind, what the COVID vaccines are is an unprecedented collaboration between experimental scientists, research, academia, clinicians, patients, volunteers, pharmaceutical industries, the whole lot, to generate something which is frankly phenomenal, something which was not even feasible when I was at medical school, and something that people have been trying to make mRNA vaccines for 2 decades and not managed it, but we managed to do it with COVID in the space of a very short space of time. But what do the public say? And clearly this is not everybody. I want to make sure, not everyone is writing. I'm not getting, not everyone is writing to me saying that COVIDs are terrible. And let's face it, 85% of the population have had their COVID vaccines and would have further if they're offered. But the people who write to me are people who say this sort of thing. Well, they're not tested. You're giving something that's not being tested. They were developed too quickly. There must be some conspiracy in here, because we've never had a vaccine for the common cold. So why suddenly have you got a vaccine for COVID? We must have already had it in waiting. Why can't you make a vaccine for another coronavirus? The efficacy is not clear. We don't know how effective they are. Despite the fact that actually calculating how the efficacy of a vaccine is incredibly difficult. The numbers that are bandied around of how the reduction in effectivity, and does it reduce spread, does it reduce transmission, incredibly difficult to put a number on that. The big thing is the death rate's far too low to warrant vaccination. I remember writing a couple of Facebook posts in April, May of last year, quoting some of the death rates from COVID infection in parts of Spain in the beginning of the pandemic, which were very high, sort of 15% mortality rate, which obviously became clear that it wasn't as high as that when you took the whole population and time into account. But people often quote the death rate of COVID as being 0.03%. So why are we even bothered when only 0.03 people will die? Then you get on to the all vaccines are dangerous. And the title for these focus, people say anti-vax, and whether you consider that to be pejorative or not, and simply some people do. And I've tried to say vaccine hesitant more than anti-vax. But there are some people who are anti all vaccines for lots of reasons, and I think Lara will go into that. There is the question of thimerosal, which is a preservative agent, which is present in a lot of vaccines. It's ethyl mercury, and there are allegations, none of which have been well-founded, that this is a dangerous thing and causes all sorts of things. And then there is what is in these new vaccines? What's in an mRNA vaccine? Is it full of fetal cells? And there's a video from a woman in America who's not medically trained in any way, who unboxes a vaccine. I don't know how she got hold of it, goes through all the ingredients and goes on a deep dive through Wikipedia and then on to prove, in quotes, that the Pfizer COVID vaccine contains fetal cells, which of course is nonsense. It doesn't. Then this has continued, and all the way through 2021, and still, I still get probably at least every day I get a message on Facebook, Twitter, email, or something telling me that the COVID vaccines are not. We shouldn't be giving them. I shouldn't support them, and that I'm dangerous in supporting them in such a public way, for reasons such as this man here in his Christmas hat, that 99.7% people recover. So why do we need a vaccine? This woman who's sat in a cafe obviously doesn't quite agree. The average age of death is 80, whatever it is, and everyone dies in their 80s, so why are we bothered? Young people don't get it, so they don't get sick and they don't die, so why should we vaccinate anybody who's young, because they're not going to get it anyway? Ignoring completely the concepts of, you know, of a herd immunity, public health, prevention of spread of infection to older, more vulnerable people, the fact that there are young people who are very, very high risk and have unwell already and will do very badly. And in my clinical practice, my colleague Dave Connell has just walked in to eat his soup and listen to Grand Rounds in person, will attest to this, is that we have heard in the last year so many people say, when admitted to Ward 42 with COVID, I did not get the COVID vaccine because I'm fit, I'm strong, I'm healthy, and I never thought I'd get it because of these things. And that list goes on to, I eat a healthy diet, I'm vegan, I was born in under the sign of Sagittarius. The people have some interesting ideas about, I don't need a vaccine because of who I am, what I am, and what I do. And then I'm sure Lara will touch on this. Then there are the feelings that all vaccines are bad and vaccines are the cause of a great number of woes to the world. This is Andrew Wakefield, who has an awful lot to answer for. He still is, he's moved to America, and here he is at an anti-vaccine lobby meeting rally in America quite recently. I think this was earlier this year. So obviously he published the link quote between MMR vaccines and autism, which was shown to be, the data was falsified. People bring up the narcolepsy allegations in H1N1 flu, which was the GSK vaccine, which has subsequently been disproven. There was a link between hepatitis B vaccines and MS, which again was disproven. There was a link alleged between the meningococcus vaccine and Guillain-Barré syndrome, which was shown to be no worse than any other vaccine and far less likely than any other viral illness. There have been recalls of vaccines, and this certainly has been thrown at me as, oh, well, what about the rotavirus thing? Rotavirus vaccines were given to children. They were shown to increase the risk of interception. That was detected within months, and the whole lot was withdrawn. And people cite to me all the time, all the yellow cards. People look at the yellow card system. There are millions of yellow cards have been handed in because of complications of the COVID vaccine. And of course, these are looked at. They're mostly minor. And if they weren't, we'd know about it. And other vaccines have been recalled because of problems that have been detected by manufacturers and then actually been found to be unwarranted. So vaccine pharmacovigilance is incredibly tight, but people don't believe us. And then the last couple of slides before I hand on to Laura about some of the other issues which still blight us in terms of vaccines, which is certain groups of people who seem to have far more vaccine hesitancy than others. So Black and ethnic minority groups do worse with COVID. That we've known that from the very beginning. And the uptake of vaccines in those communities is much lower than in the white population. We don't quite fully understand that. And there's been a lot of work done by a lot of Black and ethnic minority doctors, particularly like this chap here from London, to try to remedy that. And it's getting better, but there are some real disparities, particularly in more culturally diverse parts of the UK, such as London, Birmingham, Glasgow, where there's a massive disparity in terms of ethnicity. Religious reasons. I just picked this from, this is the Pope trying to encourage Catholics to take the vaccine, who seemingly, particularly in Southern Europe, felt that they didn't need to take the vaccine because God would protect them, where the Pope came out to say that they should have their vaccines. And then the groups which are pregnant women. The uptake in pregnant women has been very, very low. There have been deaths, maternal deaths, I think 55 maternal deaths because of COVID, almost exclusively in unvaccinated pregnant women. And this was literally 10 hours ago. So this actually, I did clip this last night when I was writing the talk, so this is still a big issue. And of course, vaccines are now being rolled out for children. And I get a absolute tirade on Facebook at the moment, and messages of how could I possibly endorse giving vaccines to children when they've not been tested? What are the long-term consequences for children having vaccines? And this is all outrageous, despite the fact we've been giving vaccines to children for 50 years, 60 years. This is what gets sent to me. So things like this looks pretty official, doesn't it? This is an agency called Safer to Wait, Protecting Children's Health. They've got a nice shiny website where they say that this group, the Children's COVID Vaccine Advisory Group, which is not a group at all, it's just a group of people who've got together and given themselves an acronym, which is CCBAG. They've written an open letter to the JCVI. There's 780 of them, and good God, do we not know that there's been deaths after vaccination, and what are we doing about it, and how could I possibly endorse all this? And it's very difficult to go up against that without saying, well, you've got 780 UK healthcare professionals on your side. I've got about 40,000 on my side who say the other. There have been alleged complications to COVID vaccines, and it takes time to go through that data to say, well, are they real? So the myocarditis and cardiac complications, particularly in young people, particularly young men, and particularly with the Moderna vaccine, have been looked into in great detail. I can share these links if you'd like. They're nice, pragmatic reviews of the incidence of these issues. And so myocarditis and cardiac complications are very rare, of the order of about 10 per 100,000, and they are mild. No one has died, and no one has had a significant cardiomyopathy that's been ongoing. And the same with neurological events. There's been a lot of worry about Guillain-Barré syndrome and other inflammatory diseases, neurological conditions. And this is I encourage you to read this, actually. It's a really nice a review with lots and lots of data showing that there is no increased risk of getting Guillain-Barré syndrome or other neuroinflammatory conditions with the vaccines, but by God, there is an increase in incidence and risk if you get COVID itself. And there's some really nice, Johns Hopkins has a really nice website if you're interested to go, and I direct people to that quite a lot. But the anti-vax movement, or the COVID hesitant people undecided, it's not helped by like this chap who went on TV to tell Sajid Javid that he was not going to get the vaccine, that he didn't need it because he'd had COVID, and therefore he himself didn't need to get the booster. There is data now showing that absolutely you get increased benefit from having the booster and the vaccines on top of having COVID. So he's been proven wrong, but he was on telly. So people listen to that, and it's difficult to get over that. There are large groups of people rolling out, doing rallies in England, particularly saying that no one should get vaccinated at all, but particularly with COVID. And what that leads to is problems like this, where we're now starting to see measles outbreaks sweeping through Africa, mainly, and the chief medical officer of Liberia thinks it's because of a drop in vaccine uptake. I was in Boston last week, not running the marathon. I don't want to talk about it very much. But whilst I was there, I went to Salem, where the witch trials happened in 1692, where three young children behaved bizarrely. They had seizures and convulsions, and the other Dr. Fard and I think that they probably had ergo poisoning, but we'll maybe look into that later. But what happened then, there was this mass hysteria that overtook Salem, because they said, well, these kids having convulsions and behaving strangely and having delusions must have been affected by witches. And there was a witch hunt, literal witch hunt through Salem, which led to this mass hysteria, and people were hung. Men and women were killed for being witches. And in one of the museums I visited, it says, why are the witch trials important today? And it talks about hysteria and how quickly misinformation can spread in Salem. And that was in 1692. How quickly can it spread now? Which brings me to this, which is the bullshit asymmetry principle, which is the amount of energy needed to refute bullshit is an order of magnitude bigger than it is to produce it. And that's the problem I think we face in trying to persuade people who are vaccine hesitant or are definitely anti-vaccine, because it's very easy to say, oh, vaccines cause whatever. Vaccines cause infertility. You don't know what's going to happen. You've no idea what the long-term effects are. And that's dead easy to say, but the effort required to refute that is probably more than one order of magnitude bigger, perhaps two or three. But I'm no expert in this. I was just asked to give my perspective of what I've seen in the last year, 2 years of being a niche internet micro celebrity. And I say that firmly with my tongue in my cheek, but just to reassure you. But what we do have is someone who does know something about this. And I'm really interested to hear what Lara has to say about vaccines and hesitancy pre and during the COVID pandemic. So I'll pass back to Ellie, who will then pass on to Lara, I think.
You will, and my buttons will respond appropriately. That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Tom. I will just encourage people to put any questions or comments they might have for you into the chat, and we'll deal with it all at the end. So without further ado, we will hand over to Lara. Thank you very much.
Lovely, thank you very much. Can people see my screen?
Yes, it's fine. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, thank you very much for that, Tom, and for introducing me. I'd probably like to be introduced more as someone with an interest in the topic rather than an expertise. It's definitely something I've taught to my undergraduates. So I'm going to actually start with some of the slides that I've used in teaching them, although probably very familiar to some of you. So vaccines and trust in vaccines were a point of interest and concern well before the COVID-19 outbreak. And these are some slides that I gave way back in the glory days of 2019. And in fact, WHO lists vaccine hesitancy as one of the top 10 threats to global health, again, even before COVID-19 or the subsequent vaccinations. And the reason for that being is that there continue to be outbreaks of viruses and diseases that would be preventable through vaccines, even in nations such as France, wealthy nations where vaccines are readily available. And it is concerning that these kinds of nations, such as France, are experiencing outbreaks of measles, and that in some surveys, 1 in 3 French citizens were disagreeing that vaccines were safe. And that's one of the highest percentages for any country worldwide. So we're not necessarily being able to attribute this to kind of developing a problem for developing nations. And as you all well know, but as I remind my students, a decision not to vaccinate poses a risk to others as well as the individual for being infected themselves. And if enough people are vaccinated, it stops the disease from spreading through the population and the idea of herd community. So these have been ideas that I've been talking about with my undergraduate students. So these are students in psychology at the University of Abertay, and trying to link to some of my research. So vaccine hesitancy, as it's now referred to, as Tom mentioned, has been around for as long as vaccines. So for as long as there has been vaccination, there has been documented and evidenced cases of vaccine hesitancies amongst a significant number of the population. And one of the problems is that often the enemies, as we might call them, is one of our own. So people who have been very successful in spreading vaccine hesitancy are often people with doctors as their title, so either medical doctors or researchers or researchers. So kind of giving a trust the expert simple mantra may not be that effective, because it is often doctors themselves who are starting some of this vaccine hesitancy, or they are producing kind of good science that then gets misrepresented by the media. And we can see, in a sense, what their gain is in some senses. I mean, you could be kind and say that they are just trying to highlight possible risks, but actually, oftentimes you can see that for many of these people, they are gaining a certain amount of fame, wealth, publications and citations, so prestige as well. And the reason why I first got in touch with Ellie is, as she said, she gave a really great kind of Q&A session at Abertay University, and she was challenged with some good questions and some difficult / in my opinion, quite ignorant questions, and she dealt with them brilliantly. And at one point, she kind of said something along the lines of, you know, the people who spread anti-vaccine messages do not have your best interests at heart. And that kind of hit home to me, because very recently, my sister, who is strong, fit and healthy and a vegan, has sent me some anti-vaccine information. And actually, I felt like my best interests were in her heart, albeit misguided. And it just made me think more carefully about how we understand the problem of vaccines and vaccine hesitancy and the transmission of messages, either be they pro-vaccine or anti-vaccine. And so we got talking, and I said that I would be very happy to be a part of this talk and try and do a bit of research myself on the wider issue. So I guess the question that I'm perhaps most interested in is, who spreads vaccine hesitancy and why does this happen? So I think one obvious thing that we can look at are personal correlates. So what I mean by this are there demographic factors that can predict vaccine hesitancy? And one obvious one that we might jump to is there a link between vaccine hesitancy and intelligence? And here is presented two pieces of evidence that I think it does relate specifically to COVID. So in a fairly large sample, Abertay et al. In 2021 found that around 17.2% of the sample indicated that they were hesitant about the vaccine. And after they adjusted for other demographic factors, such as the respondent's age, sex, and ethnicity, those with lower baseline cognition scores, i.e. a score as a proxy for intelligence, were markedly more likely to be vaccine hesitant. And likewise, very recently, Fernham found that vaccine hesitancy and rejection were associated primarily with intelligence and political beliefs, and they also found a relationship with mental illness history as well as religious beliefs, which Tom touched upon briefly somewhat. So there does seem to be evidence that there are correlations between these factors. However, it should be noted that in these papers, particularly in the Fernham 2022, effect sizes are relatively small. So we're not necessarily talking about a huge impact in relation to being able to predict vaccine hesitancy. And those are correlational studies, so they're just looking at patterns between one variable and another, but there's been some work that's tried to pick this apart a bit more through using experimental approaches where we can try and manipulate the input and measure what the output is. So in an experiment that predates COVID, but relating to vaccine hesitancy as well, De Bruyn et al. Wanted to see whether numeracy, so people's ability at understanding numbers and maths essentially, had an impact on vaccine hesitancy. And so individuals were given a test of numeracy through a number of different questions, such as can they work out percentages from proportions. And they found that numeracy, so numeric ability, was significantly correlated with being male, white versus non-white, college educated, perceiving harm reduction from getting a flu shot, and making flu shot decisions without help from others. So generally those who were more numerate were again those that that were making better, or that's a loaded word, but were less vaccine hesitant. But then the experimental component was that participants in a between subject design, participants either were shown anti-vaccine material information, which described patients who wish they had not gotten the flu shot because they subsequently got flu, or pro-vaccine by describing patients who wish they had gotten the flu shot because they subsequently did get flu. And what they found here in this figure here, hopefully you can see my mouse, but in the group with low numeracy skills, they generally perceived the information provided as being more informative than those with higher numeracy abilities. And I think what's quite interesting here is that participants with high numeracy abilities especially found the anti-vaccine narrative less informative. So those that had been told that patients wished that they hadn't have got the flu vaccine because they still got the flu. So again, we're perhaps seeing that those who are more numerate are able to engage in that kind of critical thinking of thinking, well, chances are out of everyone who does get a flu vaccine, of course, some will still go on at some point to get flu, and so not finding that information particularly valuable. But here we are starting to see that just different kinds of information may be viewed as more or less informative, and that may interact with the intelligence of the reader. And again, these results I think are somewhat informative, but again, you can see here that the effect is really quite small. They're all in a 1 to 5 Likert scale of informativeness. It's all kind of hovering around about the 3 mark anyway. And to what extent can understanding differences in things like this really help? We can't, in an ideal world we could, but in reality we can't make everyone more intelligent or more capable with numbers. So whilst I think it's a bit of an interesting background, I think it doesn't really help in terms of how can we as a body of professionals potentially increase vaccine acceptance, decrease vaccine hesitancy. So in terms of my research background, I'm interested in particular in cultural evolution. So this is the process and study of cultural transmission and change. And at times we try and draw an analogy with that of biological evolution. So we argue that human cultures change gradually throughout time as a result of a number of cultural processes, including cultural mutation, which you might prefer to use the term innovation, variation, competition, and inheritance, which we refer to as social learning. So, for example, with variation and competition, you can perhaps see cultural behaviours or tools even as you might expect in biological variation, seeing many examples of this. But also with those examples, you might see competition, and that might be in competition in relation to fitness, but fitness may be how useful something is to the individual that uses the tool or socially learns a particular behaviour. But also fitness can be in terms of how memorable or how transmittable certain information, socially learned information can be, because something could be highly useful, but if it is not well remembered or easily transmitted, then we would not expect it to evolve, to culturally kind of evolve and transmit through multiple generations. And we can also think of cultural products of there being examples of maladaptation, for example. So a QWERTY keyboard that was designed as such in the days of typewriters and was designed, the keys were spread out in such a way as to stop them jamming when they were typed upon quickly. But we still, that has evolved, the QWERTY keyboard has evolved so successfully that it continues to be used despite it not being the most useful way for keys to be laid out, given modern ways of typing. So we do see examples of maladaptation within cultural evolution. And critically, for things to transmit, we are interested in this inheritance, so how behaviours, products, information transmit from one individual to another, and that's called social learning. So this transmission of behaviour from one individual to another, and that can be done through multiple mechanisms, you know, active teaching from the model, but from the observer through imitation, emulation, stimulus enhancement, a whole range of social learning. But humans are particularly good, should I say, at social learning. We socially learn using quite sophisticated mechanisms like whole bodily imitation, active teaching, and we do so from such a young age. We copy with high fidelity, often copying negative as well as positive behaviours. But this unique ability for humans to transmit, to socially learn, is thought to kind of underpin our species' unique ability to dominate the planet. So whilst our closest living species, the chimpanzee, whilst capable of social learning, does not have the sophisticated mechanisms of imitation and teaching, still lives in the trees in east and west coast of Africa. Humans have dominated all corners of the planet and built cities and the iPad and the internet and vaccinations and everything else. So this is due to these repeated episodes of social learning over many generations, mixed with important mutations, innovations that people make. However, as with all analogies, the analogy with biological evolution does fall short at a certain point, and some people argue quite effectively that human behaviour and culture are too complicated to be aligned with biological evolution, because unlike biological evolution, within cultural evolution, change can be Lamarckian, which means if something influences an individual, they can directly transmit that change down to the next generation through social learning. Mutation is definitely not always random. We know that many innovations are designed and pre-planned. And inheritance is not only from parents, so concepts such as ancestry and where you can pinpoint where you get information from falls down quickly as well. So a limited but useful analogy in some ways. And in particular, in relation to social learning, whilst we are high fidelity social learners, we do socially learn a lot, there's a lot of evidence to say that we are selective, both consciously and unconsciously selective. So social learning is a replication of a behaviour or a tool use or a particular tool, but that's done via humans and it's done via our brains. And whilst our brains are amazing machines, in order to process the wealth of information that they have, they come up with lots of shortcuts, lots of heuristics, such as the availability heuristic, where we're much more likely to think that flying is less safe than driving a car because aeroplane crashes make the news and car crashes don't. So cognition is susceptible to these kind of heuristics and biases and conscious decision making. And so my research really tries to understand what are some of these heuristics and rules that our brains make, and how does this dictate what transmits and why it transmits. And I think that's at what point in which I can hopefully kind of speak to this in some regards. But I would emphasize that my research has tended to focus on non-human primates, so chimpanzees and capuchins, and very small human primates, so children from about age 2 up to age 18. So my research has shown that children are selective in who they copy and when they copy, and they are susceptible to a number of these biases. So before you probably all think I'm going off on too much of a tangent, I will try and bring it back to this issue of vaccine hesitancy. And I don't know whether coincidentally, but Tom and I have exactly the same image here. Well, the field of cultural evolution has been trying, again since pre-COVID, to try and see whether they can apply the general concepts and understanding of cultural evolution to provide answers to vaccine hesitancy. So, for example, in this study by Jimenez et al. In 2018, they wanted to see whether they could explain negative attitudes towards vaccinations and the spread of them using this kind of cultural evolution framework. And so they had an experiment where they simulated a vaccine controversy. And they had participants read 2 conflicting views. So all participants read both a pro and anti view about a fictional vaccine, so completely made up. And the views were held by a parent and doctor, although this swapped around between subjects. So some subjects saw a doctor that was pro and a patient that was anti, and the others saw the opposite, which I will show you briefly in a moment. And this information was transmitted along chains of 4 participants who recorded it and was passed along to the next participant within their chain. So it's a bit like the telephone game, or as it was called in the kind of 80s and 90s when I was a kid, Chinese whispers. So it's that idea that you receive information and then you're asked to transmit it. And how does that information, how much of that information is retained and how much is changed? And that's the dependent variable, the thing that they were looking to measure. And in relation to research from cultural evolution, they predicted that there would be an omission content bias. And what this essentially means is it's like that moral dilemma of, do you pull the train tracks to save 3 people, but it will kill 2 people? Well, people think that a negative outcome resulting from something you do is far worse than a negative outcome resulting in something you don't do. Ergo, it might be that people think a negative outcome that comes from actively taking a vaccine is worse than a negative outcome that comes from not having a vaccine. And there is evidence of this omission content bias in other aspects of psychology. So they said that the anti-vaccine view would be better transmitted because it emphasised the risks of vaccinations. And they also predicted an emotional content bias. So previous research within this area had shown that people remember emotional information much more than kind of dry facts. So they thought that the parents' experience-based view would transmit better across generations than the doctor's-based view. And they thought there would be an interaction of this. In essence, they thought that the parent being anti-vax would be the view that would be most successfully transmitted. So here's some of the excerpts from the article that participants were presented with. So this is one where the doctor is pro. It says the vaccination programme has been very successful. In New Zealand, 95% of the population has been vaccinated, which confers herd immunity and makes the outbreak highly unlikely. Indeed, since the introduction of the vaccine, the number of young children who require intense medical care has drastically decreased. And an anti-vax sentiment from the parent, which says, my decision to vaccinate my little boy has been a nightmare. I remember it like it was yesterday. My lovable, extremely alert baby had never produced such a blood-curdling scream as he did the moment the shot was given. 2 hours later, he was ill with fever and complained of a sore throat. The next morning, he was unable to breathe and began to turn blue. Whereas the rest of the participants were given the alternative, where the doctor is now anti-vax because he's reporting about side effects that happen after for those who have chosen to vaccinate. But again, you can see that the language is quite professional and technical. And essentially with the father who's now being pro-vaccine is kind of reporting about the awful effects of the actual disease that was preventable with the vaccine, but giving a similarly sort of emotional recollection. So what did they find? Well, their first hypothesis about this omission bias was not well supported. So if we look at this figure on the left, although the anti-vaccine message here by the 4th generation was recalled with a bit more accuracy, we're not talking about any statistically significant differences here. However, their second hypothesis was supported in that if you collapsed across which individual was pro or anti, the parental view, the father's view, was transmitted far more faithfully than the doctor's view, i.e. It's kind of more successful social information, it's being retained easier and transmitted more faithfully. When they looked at the interaction between 2 factors, again, here on the left, we're seeing where it is the father who is anti-vaccine versus the doctor who's pro-vaccine, and we're seeing really quite a big difference here about fidelity of transmission. But in the other one, where it's the father who is anti-vaccine as indicated, sorry, the father who's pro-vaccine as indicated in black, and the doctor who's anti-vaccine indicated in purple, whilst there is marginally higher recall of the father, these differences are not statistically significant, but they're definitely this prediction that it's if the parent is anti, that really is what's transmitting quite faithfully. So the experience-based view held by the parent was better transmitted than the medical-based view held by the doctor. And this links with some of the author's subsequent ideas in his further publications, where he talks about these kind of sticky ideas, and that some messages transmitted by some people, some kinds of people with anti-vaccination beliefs might spread due to having particular characteristics. So being quite simple messages, quite concrete, in this case, quite emotional, with kind of this quite unexpected blood-curdling scream element to it, kind of basically kind of quite a juicy story in a way. And there's definitely supported by other research from collaborators in the area, with research on urban legends, which shows that stories that contain things like mortality or even kind of mortifying stories about affairs. So if you've ever heard the story about the guy who comes downstairs to a surprise birthday naked because he thinks his secretary is going to be there, that would be an urban legend that transmits very faithfully, and they transmit far more faithfully than facts, statements of facts of exactly the same length. And that's because this idea that this kind of quite emotional, juicy, gossipy stories, our brains just retain and transmit far better. However, Jimenez makes the point that we can use this knowledge potentially for good, in terms of understanding that these characteristics could also be used to promote vaccinations. And if we can make pro-vaccination messages simple, concrete, a little bit emotional, and with a narrative, then there might be hope that they too would be retained and transmitted quite faithfully. Just want to also talk briefly about fake news. I know Tom talked about it as well. And I'd certainly think we've probably all seen instances of fake news around vaccinations that make your heart sink and make you worry about, well, who's being taken in by this? And I do think we do kind of focus on this element of fake news. But actually, in a really interesting article by Survey et al. That's really, again, very recently published, he argues that fake news is still the minority. So misinformation has been calculated to represent 0.1%, or 1 out of 1,000 if you're numerate, of people's online news diet in the UK. And also still, vaccine hesitancy individuals are the minority. So approximately only 6% of the UK population are vaccine hesitant. I mean, that's still alarming for many of us, but it is still very definitely the minority. So the argument within this article is that, given that most of the news consumed by the public does come from reliable sources, actually, if what we can do is try and increase acceptance of reliable information, so acceptance of pro-vaccine messages, accurate pro-vaccine messages, that would generally increase people's kind of good information score, as it were, more so than if we really try to kind of make people more cynical about fake news. So I just think that's quite an interesting argument that's being put forward there, that let's try and get people to really accept the information that we're giving them, rather than work really hard trying to get them to reject a load of fake, not even a load of fake news, the fake news that they do get. And in relation to the point made that 94% of the UK population are pro-vaccine, is it that they could be the individuals that play an important role in relaying pro-vaccination messages through informal discussion? So I was just talking to someone this morning, and they were saying, well, obviously I'm pro-vaccine, obviously I am, but I wouldn't talk about it. And is that perhaps part of the problem, is that people who are anti-vaccine really like to talk about it, and those of us that are pro don't really talk about it? So there is some research on this topic, and how we can maybe look at how we want to communicate with pro-vaccination individuals. So this study just worked with individuals who were coming into the study were pro-vaccination. and it wanted to see about whether framing messages about vaccinations would affect the plausibility and individuals' willingness to transmit those messages to other people. So in this study, they gave information about side effects and medical consensus about, again, a made-up vaccine. And they gave statistically identical but differently framed information to different individuals. So in all of these statements here concerning side effects, we're talking about 999 people not having severe side effects and 1 out of 1,000 having it. But in here, it is phrased in this quite positive way, shall I say, of it being, this really big number who don't get any severe side effects. Whereas in here, it's kind of is focusing on that one individual who did get the side effects, but it isn't using the word only. And here it omits the word only. So we might see this as perhaps the most positive spin and the least positive spin on the side effect message. And likewise with this medical consensus, presenting the big number that think vaccines are safe, presenting that first rather than focusing on those who don't think it's safe. So individuals either saw one of these 3 messages, and then they were asked to say how plausible they found the message and how likely they would be to transmit it. So down the side here, we have the messages, and we're looking here up the top here at plausibility. And we're seeing that when it's quite positively phrased, the plausibility on a Likert scale of 1 to 7, 7 being most plausible, we're seeing fairly high scores here, and that definitely is higher than some of these scores here, and definitely in the medical consensus where the mean scores are much lower than when the statistic is phrased more positively. And then when we look at willingness to transmit, sorry, this is a straight copy and paste from the paper, and rather confusingly, they've kind of moved side effects over this side and consensus over this side, just to keep us on our toes. But essentially this willingness to transmit, so asking the participants, how likely would you be to tell that message to someone else? When it is phrased quite positively, 999 are fine, they're far more happy to say that they transmit that message than when it's the 1 out of 1,000 or only 1 out of 1,000. And likewise with the medical consensus, they said they'd be far happier to transmit. The kind of 90% of doctors think it's safe versus the 10%. So I think that's quite some interesting data there about how we can potentially increase the likelihood that different messages might be transmitted by pro-vaccine individuals. So to summarise, the question that I asked at the beginning, who spreads vaccine hesitancy and why? I think we can see there definitely are personal predictors, demographic predictors of this, but effect sizes aren't always huge, and there's limited use of necessarily knowing those because there's a limited ability to fix some of these factors or change them. And perhaps it might be more useful as seeing everyone as having biases, cognitive biases, affecting whether they transmit or don't transmit certain kinds of content, and having an understanding of what these biases may be and in what contexts. So certainly the evidence suggests that emotional content will transmit more than non-emotional, but this could be true of pro and anti-vaccination messages. And increasing acceptance of accurate information may be a better tactic than decreasing acceptance of fake news. And if we can frame information positively or as positively as possible, this may increase likelihood of transmission. So even, slightly negative information about side effects, if we can frame that positively. And, can we look at ways to encourage more pro-vaccine people to speak out, to spread the message, to be part of the voice that people perhaps on the fence can hear? And how can we do that rather than just perhaps fruitlessly trying to silence those who would like to spread vaccine hesitancy. So if I wanted to give you an attempt at a take-home message, I would say it would be good to make pro-vaccine messages accurate, obviously, emotional, and with a positive spin on risk. And that's me. Thank you very much.
That's absolutely fantastic, Lara. Thank you so much. And thank you for that take-home message at the end. I think that's an important learning point for us all. We've got just a couple of minutes before we reach the hour. So if anyone has any questions or comments they'd like to make, this would be a good time for it. Tom, you've unmuted. Did you want to?
Yes, I was just going to thank my fellow speaker. I really enjoyed your talk. I thought it was really interesting. You say you're not an expert on this, but then went on to demonstrate ably that you are an expert in all this. So thank you for that. I'm clearly not an expert, but I'm just interested in the stuff towards the end about the fake news and that it's such a small proportion. What I tend to be hit with is people who are really so entrenched that they'll send me something, a YouTube video of somebody with no credibility at all, who's just got a big channel, lots of views, is spouting what sounds to be quite scientific sort of stuff, but it's all nonsense. And then you say, well, here's something credible. Here's a credible review. Here's something on, here's a paper on it. Here's a consensus statement from people who know what they're talking about. Well, here's a fact check. And then, what you get back is, oh, that's mainstream media. Mainstream media is covering it all. And then, and anyone who has the misfortune of following me on Facebook will know that, you go down this rabbit hole of endlessly trying to patiently, calmly, dispassionately try to explain the problems. And it's a really time-consuming, challenging thing to do. Do you think that people who are that entrenched, it's possible to change their mind, or is that it's done? They've made their mind up and it's gone, and we're better at directing our efforts elsewhere. And a sort of follow-up to that is, if we're going to label them anti-vax and a lost cause, is the vaccine hesitant group, which are the people who are sitting on the fence. They're the people I've tried to not target, that's the wrong word, but if I can persuade anybody, those are the people, and they tend to seem to be a little bit more persuadable with data and facts, etc.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an excellent question, and I wouldn't say I definitely have the answer. I think when you're starting to see a more generalized attitude towards things like mainstream media or Western medicine, there may well be a bigger issue at play about individuals who have low trust in authority, who are susceptible to paranoid thinking, and even within the typical population, kind of schizotypals who tend to have that kind of slightly off neutral information might make a more paranoid interpretation, and that's very complicated. So I guess I feel sometimes in a way with people that entrenched, would I use a lot of effort to try and change their view? Probably not. So yeah, I think but is there a way we can stop them being able to be the effective models from which people who are on the fence or vaccine hesitancy are learning or getting the vast majority of their information from? And I think that, because that's probably a far bigger and more fruitful population, are those that are trying to acquire information, and the entrenched person is shouting quite loudly, whereas the rest of us, and let's face it, I'm entrenched with my pro-vaccine views, but I'm not really shouting about it on social media or Twitter in the same way. So whether it is more about trying to turn our efforts to that, I don't know. It is difficult.
Yeah, I said in my talk at the beginning there that group has 750 doctors who it says, and I've not checked their names on the register or anything, but it says 750 doctors who support waiting and don't want vaccination. On the GMC register at the end of 2020, which is the soonest the latest data I can find, there were 300,000 doctors on the register. So that's 750 out of 300,000. But as you say, it's trying to get across that 298,250 of us support the idea rather than 750.
Yeah. Well, and with that, excuse my ignorance, but I think they said healthcare professionals, so that would be a much wider umbrella as well, wouldn't it?
Yeah, and the Barrington Declaration, remember that that old chestnut from 2020, which was signed by I think 3,000 or 4,000 again healthcare professionals, and I did read all the signatories of the Barrington Declaration, and many of them were from Europe, and were homeopathic doctors, osteopaths, and had qualifications which would not be recognised as healthcare professionals in the UK or
a significant proportion of the UK ones were retired as well, I noted.
Yeah, and also from specialties where I wouldn't say that necessarily had a huge amount of expertise in that area. You know, I don't think I would sign a petition about gynecology, for example. But yeah, I thought your talk was excellent, Lara. I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much for presenting. I really enjoyed that.
Absolutely.
Thank you. And just a plea, if anyone is particularly interested and wants to drop me an email about this, please do. As I say, I don't feel I'm yet particularly an expert specifically in the vaccine element, but would definitely be interested in talking about collaborations or that sort of thing.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for coming. And thanks to our audience as well. I believe, oh, Jane, did you want to?
Hello, yes, I just thought I would come in and say thank you. I thought that was very interesting. It fits with all the sort of health promotion work that we're trying to do in the community, in that a narrative from an individual that's emotive has far more effect than all the science that we can bring. And so how do we become much more media savvy with a catchy message, which is not at all what they teach us in medical school or anywhere else. But that was my final comment.
Well, we'll fix that one day, Jane. We will manage to find the emotive version of the good news story rather than the bad news story. That's the thing we need to make it powerful, isn't it?
Indeed.
Fantastic. Well, we're out of time today, but thank you so much again to both our speakers, Lara and Tom. I hope that others have had a enjoyable session as well. And I believe there's another talk next week, Tom. So same place, same time.
Yep, same place, same link. Surgery next week. When does abdominal pain become a surgical problem? So I'd be fascinated to find that out myself. So looking forward to that. All right, thanks again. Thanks to Ellie for chairing today. I really appreciate it. Thanks to everyone for coming. See you next week.
Thanks a lot.